and I'm going to hand straight away over now to our first speaker, who is David Adam. And David is a journalist by training, and his book, The Man Who Couldn't Stop, talks about his own experience of OCD, and he's particularly helping us with trying to combat some of the myths surrounding OCD. So I'm going to hand straight over to David, and enjoy your day.
Thank you. I'm quite tempted to copy Gillian and just get you all to talk between yourselves. It makes it a lot easier. Thanks very much to Joel and the charity for inviting me to speak here. It's quite poignant for me to be here because 20 years ago I was living just down the road, and that was at about the worst of my OCD. I don't know if any of you have read this marvellous book, but there's a scene in there in which I talk about a swimming pool, changing rooms, and I'm getting myself into a mess. That was, I think it's knocked down now, but the Oxford Road student sports facilities just down the road. So it's quite interesting to come back 20 years later, and I think if I'd known then that I'd be coming back here to talk to a room full of people with OCD, I think I would have thought said I was even more crazy than I thought I was at the time. Certainly the weather's a lot better here than it used to be. It's good to see the sun shining. When I lived here, the pavements were never dry. So welcome, thank you all for coming. It's a real privilege to get to talk to you first. The reason that I am talking to you is because I did write this book about OCD. It turns out when you write a book about OCD and you have OCD, people want to know a lot about what happened to you and your own experiences. I'm a journalist. I write about science, and I was very interested in writing an account of sort of the science and the history and the politics and the psychology of OCD. But at various stages through the process, I was encouraged to put more of my own story in there. You can hear me at the back, right? Yeah. To put more of my own story in there as a way of sort of helping the story along. I used to work for the Guardian newspaper, so when the book came out, the Guardian bought the rights to serialise it and very carefully cut out all of the science and history and psychology and ran sort of 8 pages about how shit my life has been. But, so it's quite nice to talk about other things sometimes about OCD, and that's what I'm going to do today. Although if you do want to know how shit my life has been, it's all in there. I should say there is a clock at the back, but they've made it really small. So if you see me squinting, I'm not being rude. I'm just trying to see how much time I've got left. So how do we see OCD? So I'm a journalist, and I'm like annoyingly literal about these sort of titles that I get given to talk about. So when Joel told me about this one, I instantly thought, well, who's we? And I think in this case, I'm only really qualified to talk about how I see OCD, but I think we can try and picture how other people see OCD, because that's the way that most people, the way that they think about OCD is the way that they respond to it and respond to us, and the way they talk about it. And I think the most obvious thing to say is that most people see OCD, but it isn't really OCD, because of course you can't really see OCD. OCD is a very easy to hide mental illness. It's a very portable mental illness. There are clearly some aspects of it which are more visible than others. But in my own case, my OCD is related to a chronic fear of HIV infection. I grew up in the 80s with all those dreadful adverts telling us we were all going to die if we had sex. You know, if you can imagine as a 15-year-old virgin, well, I shouldn't have to imagine I was a 15-year-old virgin. Watching those adverts, it put the fear of God into me. So that caused me huge amounts of distress, but it was pretty much invisible to everybody else. I told a handful of people in 20 years. When I signed the deal to write the book, I said to the publishers, you can't tell anyone. They wanted a press release. I said, you can't, because I need to tell my parents and my family. And it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and that says a lot after someone who's had OCD for 20 years. But I Skyped my parents, and I'm now a parent, and I know that this phrase, I think, fills all parents with dread. I said to them, can you both come to the phone at the same time? Because I've got something to tell you. And I told them, I said, I've got good and bad news. The good news is I'm writing a book. And they said, oh, what's it about? I said, that's the bad news. So most people don't really see OCD unless we choose to show it to them. I think that's the first thing to say. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do because, of course, people with OCD feel very private, very embarrassed, very ashamed, and very nervous and worried that people are going to judge them for the kind of things that they think, and they can't help thinking. Because I think that's probably the most important thing that I realised when I started to research and write about this, was that it is about thought. It's a pathology of thought, and that is it's a very easy way to communicate it to people, because now when people say to me, oh, so what's your book about? I say, first of all, I say, haven't you read it? And then I say, well, you know, you get those thoughts, like when you're waiting for the train and the train comes and you think, oh, I could just jump. And they go, and they look a bit like you just read their mind to start with. And they say, yeah. I say, well, it's about that. And they go, oh. So what, do other people think that? I said, yeah, almost everybody thinks thoughts like that. And OCD is, an easy way of explaining it is just when you can't switch them off. And then when you can't switch a thought off, you change your behaviour, because that's what you have some control over. So that's the way I explain it to people. And most people then go, oh yeah. And then you have a connection, because almost everybody has a story like that. Almost everybody has, oh yeah, I do this thing or I do this thing when I do that. And then you say, well, just imagine you can't stop it. But that has to be explained to people, because you can't see the thoughts. So what you tend to see, in some cases with OCD at least, are the compulsions. And this is why I think there is this misconception that OCD is a behavioural quirk. And it's partly down to the fact that the compulsions are visible. So of course they come to define the condition. It's also down to a very, very unfortunate clash with a different condition called obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is largely about cleaning and feeling the need for this sort of everything to be just so and perfect, but for its own sake, because you clean if you've got obsessive compulsive personality disorder because you really like cleaning, not because you're doing it as a compulsion to try and ward off dreadful thoughts. And yet, when people refer to OCD, even people who can be quite knowledgeable about other aspects of medicine, they're quite often referring to obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And this is, the OCD cleaners programs, and Monica from Friends having OCD, and this kind of stuff. And so there is this misconception that OCD is about these behaviours, and these repetitive behaviours, which often almost revolve around cleaning or counting. Now, as you will all know, parts of OCD can exhibit themselves in those ways, but largely almost always as a direct response to the thoughts. And that's what I try and tell people. It's a bit like, so people, when I say I've got OCD, they say, oh, I bet your house is really clean. Or, and I said, well, yeah, you want to come and see it. There are people with OCD who they might wash their hands like 20 times an hour, but they wear the same pants for a month. It is very, very specific, and that's the other thing that's quite confusing sometimes about OCD, is that because it's about thought and a pathology of thought, the spectrum of ways that it can manifest itself is limited only by the human imagination. There is just an infinite variety of number of ways that this can a condition can affect people. And it does tend to bunch in groups, but it really defies any kind of easy way of saying this is what OCD is all about. And in fact, one of the big debates I always hesitate talking about what's going on in psychiatry when there are a whole load of psychiatrists at the front of the room, or psychologists. But one of the debates in psychiatry and psychology is about how you sort of categorise these different conditions and whether actually it would make more sense to break them down and analyse them by symptoms rather than trying to group them together. So, for example, someone who checks all the time and their compulsion is checking the door actually could be quite different when you break it down into what's going on than someone who constantly feels the need to wash their hands or whatever. But those things are all brought together as OCD. So when people say, "Oh, I've got OCD because I like to line up my DVDs," or when a shop sells an OCD, I can't remember what it was now, there was some kind of cleaning gel or something, for the OCD in you. Charities like this get quite cross, and quite rightly so. Personally, I'm quite not relaxed about it, but I can understand where that comes from. It's an ignorance, but I personally believe it's a very pure form of ignorance. It is just based about people not knowing. And the reason people do not know is because people like me do not tell them. Because it's awful to even think about, never mind to tell people you have these thoughts. I mean, it took me 20 years to tell my parents what I've just told a room full of total strangers in 2 minutes. It is difficult to say these things, which is why it's so important that there are groups like OCD Action and other charities that will challenge that on people's behalf, because I'm quite sanguine, but lots of people aren't so sanguine and actually get quite annoyed because they think it trivialises the distress. There is a more fundamental reason why it's important that we challenge the misleading impression that OCD is just about cleaning and order. And it's not really about offence. It's about the more that those kind of concepts are cemented in the public consciousness, the more people with OCD think that's what it is. Because people with OCD get their information from the same place as everybody else does. Unless, of course, they're members of this excellent charity. But when you see someone on TV talking about OCD because they like to line up their Coke cans, and they're being congratulated for doing so, for coming out with this dreadful affliction, it's very easy to think, well, Jesus, what's wrong with me? Because I have thoughts about drowning my baby. I mean, can you think of anything worse? I don't have OCD because I'm not worried about germs. I have these thoughts about hurting people. So, God, I must be something much worse than having OCD. And that does two things. It stops people going for help. Well, first of all, it stops them being aware that there is help. Because even if they realise that there is help for OCD, they don't think they have OCD, because they have these dreadful thoughts. And even if they know that there is help out there for OCD, it can stop them going to get it, because they think when they go to the doctor and they say, hi, I have these really dreadful thoughts about harming people, the doctor's going to say, well, it doesn't sound like OCD to me, because do you line up your Coke cans? And that happens. That really happens, because not only people with OCD get their information from the same place as everyone else, but so do doctors and the medical profession. When I went for help to my GP, I was told, not sure there's much we can do. Turns out I lived 6 miles from a world-leading OCD treatment centre. Not sure there's much we can do, but I'll just make a call just to find out. I'm not trying to be rude about GPs. As I said, there is this ignorance, but it's a very pure form of ignorance. They just don't realise. And this goes right to the top. I work for Nature, the science journal. When my book came out, I was contacted by, I won't name her, but she's a very, very top neuroscientist in the US who does really cutting-edge research with like genetics and circuitry in the brain, and really, really top-class stuff. And so she runs her own lab, and she has postdocs, and she writes papers and all this stuff. She's a fully fledged, proper, grade A academic. And she wrote an email and said, thank you, because when I apply for grants, like when she, this amazing scientist, writes letters to the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, this billion-dollar taxpayer-funded institute which gives out money to scientists to work on the greatest problems of the age, she says, they say to me, you want to do what? OCD? Well, that's not really a problem, is it? We're going to give all our money to schizophrenia or autism or depression or bipolar disorder, because people think those are real problems. And that's why it's important to challenge the misleading impression of OCD, because it's the only way you get the correct information out there. And that's so important. People say to me, oh, have you written your book to raise awareness or to challenge stereotypes? And I said, well, actually, I haven't. To be honest, I don't think I'm that noble. I just wanted to tell the story of what it's like and what it is. And the only people who can really tell that story with the greatest of respect to the psychologists and psychiatrists in the front row are the people with OCD. Because it's a very odd experience, as I think most of you know. But critically, this is absolutely critical, the psychiatrists and the psychologists and the people who talk to you today really know how to help. They might not be able to explain the condition in the way that I can or other people with OCD can, but they can really help. Really help. And the help is out there. And anything that stops people who are in the condition I was in 20 years ago, and some of you may be in that condition today, seeking and receiving that help is worth challenging. Never mind the social implications of the stigma associated with broader mental illness. I take almost pride now in telling people that I have a mental illness. I wear this T-shirt. Because, people say, oh, did you know that 1 in 4 people have a mental illness? Isn't that shocking? Actually, I'm surprised it's that low. I mean, how many people have a physical illness at some point in their lifetime? Everybody, right? Everybody. Unless you're Damien out of The Omen, the Antichrist who had never had a cold. Everybody has something go wrong with their legs or their lungs or their heart or their arms or their fingers or whatever it is. And they are nothing compared to the complexity of the brain. Nothing. It's a miracle that your brains work at all, given the amount of random fluctuations and stuff that's going on inside. So the fact that sometimes they need a little bit of fine adjustment is not surprising at all to me. And I think 3 out of 4 people are liars if they say they never had anything go wrong with their brain. And that is another. That's not just restricted to OCD, of course. That's about mental illness more generally. But the more people who can talk and advocate and represent and get people together for meetings like this, the more people. I know there are other people here who've written books. You're going to hear from Ellen, who does a great job of talking to people about it. It's ultimately the only way that you can change how we see OCD. And by we there, I mean society and all that it involves. Because this isn't just about people with OCD not being understood by people without OCD. It has to go deeper than that. It has to be a more richer awareness of the human experience. And that's what I think OCD is. It's a connection to people. It's not something that separates people and shouldn't make us feel alone and isolated, which I know it does, because we think we're the only people who think this way. So when you do talk about OCD, and I hope you do, but if you don't, that's completely up to you. Just buy them my book. tell them about those intrusive thoughts. Tell them about you know what happens when you waiting for a train, and they go, oh yeah, and then you're off and running, and you can tell people as much or as little as you want about your own experiences, but they will then tell somebody next time that they hear someone misuse the term OCD. And I think that way we can all get to see OCD with, hopefully, in a fairer and a more helpful way. Thank you.